U.S. inflation reached a new high in April 2026, with consumer prices hitting 3.8% and breaking past the peak levels we saw 3 years ago. For the average consumer, this means an immediate, painful increase in the cost of essentials, primarily driven by a spike in both energy and grocery prices. At the same time, real wages have dropped for the first time in 3 years. Households are now exhausting the last of their pandemic-era savings just to maintain their standard of living. Corporations are starting to buckle under the strain too. Walmart recently announced it is cutting or relocating roughly 1,000 corporate staff as the retail giant tries to streamline its global operations. This multi-front economic squeeze has created a high-pressure environment at home, forcing the public to look for a specific cause for their financial distress. It's a common reflex to blame domestic policy in Washington for the prices we see at the pump and the grocery store. However, the actual catalyst for these shrinking bank accounts is a conflict unfolding 7,000 miles away in our highly integrated global economy. The local price of bread or fuel is often dictated by geographic flashpoints on the other side of the planet. That flashpoint is the current war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. While public briefings suggest the Iranian military has been effectively neutralized, classified U.S. intelligence assessments from this month paint a more troubling picture. Leaked reports show that Iran has restored operational access to 30 of its 33 critical missile sites. These 33 sites are positioned almost entirely along the Strait of Hormuz, a maritime choke point only 21 miles wide. Using mobile launchers, Iran can project threat radii across the entire waterway, holding both American warships and commercial oil tankers effectively hostage. This relatively low-cost military strategy has successfully paralyzed one of the most important energy arteries in the world. The direct military cost is already substantial, with the U.S. spending $29 billion in the first 60 days of the conflict alone. But the broader economic impact is concentrated in the global energy markets, where the closure of the strait has triggered a massive supply shock. We can track the results on this gas station sign. Average U.S. gas prices have surged nearly 28% over the past 2 months. That energy spike ripples through the entire supply chain. High shipping fuel costs make transporting food more expensive, which is the primary driver of the grocery hikes and that 3.8% inflation rate. By cutting off the energy flow at the strait, a regional military standoff has been converted into a national cost of living crisis for American households. This has left the U.S. administration in a strategic trap. An ongoing military stalemate abroad is fueling an unsustainable economic blowback at home. To prevent domestic support from eroding completely, Washington needs a way to stabilize prices without relying on a quick military resolution in the Middle East. This pressure forced a sudden diplomatic pivot. President Trump arrived in Beijing this week for a high-stakes summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The administration also mobilized an unprecedented delegation, bringing nearly $1 trillion worth of corporate leadership to the negotiating table. The group included key tech titans like NVIDIA's Jensen Huang and Apple's Tim Cook. The U.S. is effectively deploying its most valuable economic assets to negotiate a financial ceasefire with its primary geopolitical rival. Washington is looking for a technological buffer, massive manufacturing efficiencies that can lower prices even as energy costs remain high. These are dark factories, highly advanced, automated manufacturing centers that run on AI and robotics without a human workforce. Securing partnerships with these Chinese systems could lower production costs enough to artificially offset the inflation caused by the war. It is a striking irony. A failure to secure energy in the Middle East has forced the United States to accelerate its economic integration with its biggest competitor. For decades, Iran's primary leverage has been a threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. By holding the world's most critical maritime choke point hostage, Tehran aimed to provoke international panic and pull the United States into a massive, conventional military conflict. Washington met the move at Hormuz by refusing the expected escalation. Carrier strike groups and surveillance drones established total American dominance without launching a single air campaign. They established a perimeter and waited. This map shows the physical and economic layers of the trap. First, a naval blockade stopped all Iranian maritime movement. Simultaneously, an economic seal cut off the revenue from oil exports and the refined fuel imports that keep the country's domestic infrastructure running. The isolation worked because it was targeted. While Iranian shipping was halted, Saudi, Qatari, and Emirati vessels continued to move through the strait under U.S. protection. This eliminated the international pressure Tehran expected to generate by threatening global energy markets. In strategic terms, this is a zugzwang. a position where any move Iran makes only worsens its standing. Mining the waters invites a tighter blockade. Attempting to negotiate triggers accusations of treason from hardliners. Every reactive choice forces the pressure to turn inward. Inside Tehran, the pressure has fractured the regime into warring factions. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, led by Commander Ahmad Vahidi, is demanding total military escalation and branding any mention of diplomacy as a betrayal. This hardline stance is tied to the IRGC's survival. The organization controls up to 40% of Iran's domestic economy, including banking, telecommunications, and major construction. This economic empire is built on a narrative of permanent conflict. Without an external enemy to justify their dominance, the IRGC's control over civilian sectors becomes a political liability. Facing them is the diplomatic and presidential wing, which is watching the currency collapse and infrastructure fall into ruin. They are calling for an urgent negotiated deal to prevent a $270 billion reconstruction crisis they cannot afford to fund. This creates a stalemate at the top of the government. Ending the conflict threatens the IRGC's institutional wealth, but continuing it physically destroys the nation's remaining economic foundations. At the center of the domestic crisis is the refinery paradox. Despite being a top global oil producer, Iran cannot refine enough crude to meet its civilian needs. It relies on a loop of refined fuel imports that the blockade has effectively severed. The result is the sight of an oil-rich nation running out of gas. Supply chains have collapsed, and lines at gas stations now stretch for blocks. This scarcity has broken the regime's 45-year social contract. For decades, the public accepted limited political freedom in exchange for basic needs like cheap gasoline and subsidized bread. With those subsidies gone, compliance has evaporated. This economic fracture is spilling into the streets. Daily power cuts and empty gas stations have triggered protest waves across dozens of cities simultaneously. Because these eruptions aren't concentrated in a single urban center, the IRGC's model of rushing forces into a flashpoint to restore order is failing. They simply cannot suppress everywhere at once. The blockade made the costs of the IRGC's strategic choices immediately visible. It didn't need to create the resentment. It simply removed the subsidies that were keeping that resentment in check. Perhaps the most dangerous failure is the fracturing of the armed forces. Iran maintains two militaries, the ideologically favored IRGC and the conventional conscript-heavy army known as the Artesh. For decades, the regime has treated the Artesh as second class, with lower pay and fewer resources. Under the resource starvation of the blockade, this resentment has turned into open hostility. There are reports of IRGC units hoarding medical supplies and refusing to evacuate wounded Artesh soldiers, citing logistic shortages while their counterparts die of treatable wounds. On the front lines, the Artesh is experiencing a total logistics collapse. Units are reporting a lack of drinking water and are being issued only 20 rounds of ammunition per 2 soldiers, an amount that lasts only seconds in a sustained firefight. This mistreatment has led to mass desertions, with entire formations abandoning their posts. In several cities, protesters have begun chanting directly to the troops, inviting the army to side with the people against the Revolutionary Guards. By cutting the financial flows that kept these two militaries unified, the U.S. has created a scenario where the regime now faces the threat of an internal mutiny. Iran's external support is also disappearing. China, which once purchased 90% of Iranian oil, has prioritized its own Gulf commercial interests. Beijing statements now focus on keeping the strait open for international trade, signaling that it will not intervene to save Tehran. Russia has taken an even colder approach. While offering diplomatic solidarity, Moscow is actively offering to replace Iranian oil in Chinese markets, profiting from the blockade that is strangling its partner. The axis of resistance is watching the core dissolve. An IRGC operation to break the blockade using fast boat swarms was neutralized by U.S. forces in 20 minutes. For proxy organizations relying on Iranian backing, the failure to protect the strait signals Tehran can no longer guarantee their security or funding. There is a final physical deadline approaching, the geological clock. In approximately 10 to 14 days, Iran's domestic oil storage will be completely full. When storage reaches capacity, the wells must be shut down. This releases underground pressure and causes permanent reservoir damage, which will degrade Iran's ability to produce oil even after a deal is eventually reached. The blockade has remained in place without a single American missile strike. Instead, Washington is letting the social, economic, and geological clocks run out. Washington has engineered a situation where the Iranian state is being forced to defeat itself. The danger is no longer a conventional war with the West, but the terminal convulsions of a fracturing nuclear power that is running out of options as quickly as it is running out of